In this video, I want to explain to you the difference between rip cutting and cross cutting. And it matters quite a lot, actually. And the difference between the two comes down to the fact that wood behaves very differently along its grain as compared with across its grain. So when I say along its grain, I mean the direction that the tree grew in. So this is a board, and the tree grew like this. Oh, it could have been like this too. I'm not sure which way around it was in the tree, but this is the way it grows. And actually, if you look here on the end, you can see some growth rings. So if the tree was cut off here, we would see these rings, and one ring for each ear. So this is a section of the log. We really don't know how big the log was. I can tell from looking at these growth rings that this is a fairly fast growing tree, which I guess is nice because it gives you lumber more quickly, but it's not so nice in that the wider the growth rings, the softer the wood is. So this is a piece of white pine. White pine can grow very quickly or quite slowly. If it grows slowly, we could have, in this space here, say, between these two growth rings, if this was a slow growing tree, we might have 4, 5, 6 years in this space instead of 1 year. And if we did, it would be harder wood and higher quality, all else being equal. But the main topic for this video is ripping and cross-cutting. So that's the direction of the grain. That's along the grain, it's called. And this would be across the grain. So cross-cutting is cutting across the grain. And all else being equal, that's the easiest kind of cut to do. So it's just because the saw, whatever saw you're using, whether it's a hand saw or some sort of a power saw, it's slicing through the fibers when you make a crosscut. And when you're slicing through the individual fibers, it actually cuts pretty well. It's a lot easier to cross-cut a piece of wood than it is to rip cut a piece of wood. And that's because when you're ripping, you're kind of working parallel to the wood fibers, so you're not severing them. And it's just a whole lot harder to make a cut. Not only that, but when you're rip cutting, you really should have a different kind of blade too. The teeth, instead of being like little knives, like this one here, it's more like they're little chisels. So when you're rip cutting, you're actually taking out curls of wood, kind of ribbons of wood from along the length. In a very narrow width, of course, the width of the saw blade. As a beginner, working with standard widths of wood, you won't be ripping very often. You will be cross-cutting all the time. And so I'm just going to make this little cross-cut here. You've seen me do this sort of thing before, but I've marked it. I'm going to start the cut with my thumb here. I'm going to be cutting on the waist side of the line. I'm going to be, as you recall from a previous video, I'm using the reflection of the wood in the saw blade. I want that reflection to be continuous along this edge here. I don't want it to be like that or like that. I want it to look continuous, to look like the reflection is the continuous edge of the board. I'm going to get my hand away. I'm going to keep my eye on that line, and I'm going to work on the waist side of the line, blowing off the sawdust with my mouth periodically, just so I can see the line. See how far I advance with each stroke of the blade? It's quite remarkable, really. There, a nice cross cut. Now, by comparison, let me show you what ripping would be like. Just using my combination square to make just any old kind of parallel line. Just to show you. So, I'm going to do the same thing, but watch how much more slowly the same saw in the same piece of wood with the same strokes, I'm applying the same amount of force, just look how much more slowly it progresses through. that's making decent progress. But I would estimate it's probably 1/3 as fast as cross-cutting. And that's just because ripping is more challenging. In fact, in practice, most woodworkers, they're not ripping by hand. That's a very unusual thing. It is something that I used to do when I started out for many years. I didn't have a saw, power saw, that could rip wood, so I had a saw like this for cross-cutting, and then I had another kind of saw that was especially for ripping, and I used those two. And a dedicated ripping saw in a cut like this would probably cut about twice as fast as what you saw. So this saw is usable, especially for small little cuts. If you want to cut something to width that's fairly small, this will work for you. There are dedicated hand saws, but my recommendation would be if you're getting to the point where you need to cut wood fairly often, then you should be looking at some kind of a table saw. Not necessarily a big one, but some kind of table saw would make your life a whole lot easier.